Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. Today I want to revisit a post that I did a few months ago of the Wizard Nebula. And as with most things, my processing has changed, so I want to update that video and show you the way I would process it today. So join me and let's go through PixInsight and Photoshop. So last fall, I recorded a complete start to finish showing the capture process of the Wizard Nebula and then the processing kind of from start to finish, including PixInsight, and then where I do most of my work is actually in Photoshop. And I thought it would be a good time to update this because my workflow has changed somewhat, partly due to some new tools that are available and partly just due to the evolution of finding new and better ways to do things. And probably 6 months from now, I'll be doing something different again. But this is an example of the updated finished image using what I call as a natural SHO, or natural sulfur hydrogen oxygen, which is the Hubble palette. And so I want to walk through how we get from PixInsight through Photoshop to create this image. I'm going to go somewhat quickly through the PixInsight steps because this isn't really intended to be a complete tutorial on PixInsight. There's lots of places where you can see that on YouTube. What I really want to focus on are the things I do differently in Photoshop. So let's jump into PixInsight and get started. And as I always do, I normally start by running the batch preprocessing, WBPP. And actually the first step would be to go through the images and call out the ones that are not as good, because while you want to have as much data as possible, you're better off to have fewer good frames than a few good frames mixed in with lots of bad frames. But this was the setup for WBPP, and I am using two monitors, and you'll occasionally see me drag things in from the second monitor. You'll also see that even though I'm looking at the monitor I'm working on, the camera is actually off to the side, so I'm not actually looking directly at the camera, so I apologize for that. But the setup for WBPP, I have my light frames loaded, flats, darks, and biases, and I have both some 2-minute red, green, and blue subs, as well as some 60-second red, green, and blue. And even though I ran all of these, I didn't do anything with the 60 seconds, so we'll just ignore those even though they are here. The rest of the setup is pretty straightforward. If I go to the calibration tab, one of the things I always do is set a pedestal value, usually around 300. That gives me a cleaner result. Sometimes if I have not much data, I may have to push that a little bit higher. And then in this case, I just did auto for the reference frame selection. If I'm shooting on a second night and I want to add to what I ran from the previous day or 2 previous days or whatever, I'll choose manual, and then I'll look at the log file to see what reference frame was used originally, and then continue to use that same reference frame. And then, of course, I have an output directory for the Wizard. So I ran through all of this, and this is in total about 15 hours of data. So once this is done, my process is to combine the red, green, and blue into an RGB image and extract the stars. And I'm primarily after the stars in that RGB image. And then I'll process the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen separately and create eventually 4 files that will open in Photoshop: the RGB stars, and then the narrowband red, green, or sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then we'll do all of our color mapping and retouching in Photoshop. So just to very quickly walk through that process in PixInsight, I would load, and you can just double click on the background here to bring up the open palette, the open dialog box. And in the swap files for the Wizard, here's my 120-second sorry, red, green, and blue. So these are the 2-minute red, green, and blue files. So I'll just click open, and that'll open each one of those. And remember, these are each monochrome files captured with a monochrome camera, showing just the red, just the green, just the blue through a RGB filter. So generally what I do is I'll just start with channel combination, and I've got some of my saved process icons over here on the right, and just very quickly drop the red into the red channel, green into the green channel, blue into the blue channel. That gives me red, green, blue. Click on the circle to execute that. So now I've got an RGB composite image. I can close the channel combination, and I can close each one of these because we're done with those for now. I'll just do a quick screen stretch to see what we're working with. Usually it'll have quite a color cast to it. In this case, it has kind of a reddish color cast. Sometimes it's green, sometimes it's cyan. First thing I want to do is run dynamic background extraction, and I'll run that in subtraction mode. And again, I have a saved process icon that has samples around the perimeter. So I'll execute this, and that will more or less neutralize the background and bring us to something that's a little bit more closely resembles a nice RGB image. And we can update our screen stretch. Generally, the next thing I do now is run the spectrophotometric color calibration, and I have a saved process icon for the monochrome camera and one if I'm using the one-shot color camera. This is already pre-configured with the filter settings, so I'll just drop that onto the image, and this will give us true life colors in the stars. Generally the saturation is not very high, and I find especially when I combine it with an SHO image that because I'm boosting the brightness and the saturation quite a bit, generally I'll need to reduce the stars and heighten the saturation in order to get it to show through. So that's finished. It has done its work of color coordinating or color balancing the stars, and we'll just see where we're at here. So there's an updated screen stretch. The next thing I do is run Blur Exterminator. This is really something new since the last time I did this process. Generally, I'll look at the stars and try to just make a quick judgment. Are they a lot too big, a little too big? Because this not only sharpens, it also will reduce the stars a little bit. And usually I will bump up the star sharpness to 30 to 35, depending on how aggressive I want to be. This not only sharpens the stars, it also sharpens the background, but in this case we won't be using the background. But you'll notice one of the main things it does is minimize the stars, so it tightens them up quite a bit and gives you nice, detailed, sharp stars. This normally takes most of the AI processes like Star Exterminator and Blur Exterminator take about 30 seconds to run. So right now I'm just kind of rambling on a little bit, waiting for this to finish. We're at about 70%. There's 80%, so it's just about done. And there it is. So now I need to stretch this to convert this into a non-linear image. It's still linear at this point, which you can tell by the green bar by the file name. And I do this real simply. I just use the screen transfer function in combination with the histogram transfer. And I've got the channels linked, and we want to keep those linked because we just did a color balance. So I'll update the view, and we can zoom in. I'm using the scroll wheel on the mouse to zoom in and out to see more closely where the sliders are. And I'll usually darken this down a little bit and again, I'm doing this primarily for the stars. So darkening a little bit here, again, will darken the stars. If I want to also capture an RGB background, I might duplicate the image at this point and process it twice, once for RGB and once just for the stars. But at this point, I'm really just looking at the stars. And you know the routine, you copy the data from the screen transfer function down to histogram, apply that, turn off the screen stretch, and there's our stretched image. So at this point, I'll do two more things. I'll run Noise Exterminator. I haven't done a serious comparison. I probably should, but I always run Noise Exterminator. I might get a little bit better looking stars if I didn't. It's something that I should probably test sometime. But it runs quickly, it cleans up the background, and there we have our nice, clean, noise-free image. And now I'll just extract the stars. I'll open Star Exterminator, generate the star image, and I always use unscreen, and we'll run this. The end result of this is going to be the file that I'm going to save as a 16-bit TIFF image, and that's just the star image. I don't think I'm going to do anything with the RGB background in this case, so all I really need is the stars. And it's moving along here, so we're about 30%. I say this normally takes with my machine and with the graphics coprocessor, it normally runs about 30 seconds on the 62 megapixel images from the ASI 6200. And just about there, and there it is. So this is the star image that I want to save. I will sometimes, while it's still in this fairly raw state, I may boost the saturation a little bit. To do that, I would just open up curves, create a quick preview, go to saturation, boost the saturation a little bit. Oops, getting too many points here. Boost the saturation a little bit. Maybe something like that, but might be getting a little too aggressive, but we can always tone it down in Photoshop, so I'll apply that. Close the preview, close curves, and at this point I would be ready to just go File, Save As, and I'll navigate to the folder where I want to save this, which would be in my Wizard folder, and choose TIFF, and then Save. And I've actually already done these, so I'm not going to do them again. But that's the process I would go through for the stars. I can set this aside. And I don't think I'm going to do anything with the RGB, but I'll hang on to it for now anyway. The next step is to open the three narrowband, so sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we'll work these individually. And normally they open hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and so I just work them in reverse. One of the nice things about that is it kind of saves hydrogen, which is usually the most exciting of the narrowband images. It saves it for last. So let's just throw a quick screen stretch on it, see what we've got. Process here is pretty much just walking through the mechanics of it. I don't really see much of a gradient in this, so I'm not even going to bother with dynamic background extraction. I'll go straight to Blur Exterminator, and I'll just run that with the defaults. Again, this will take about 30 seconds. But now I'm less interested in sharpening the stars and more interested in sharpening the nebula in the background. And I should probably point out it's not really sharpening, it's deconvolution, deblurring. We'll actually do our sharpening in Photoshop once we get there. But you will see the stars tighten up and shrink quite a bit, and it does a good job of taking away some of that lens blur from the nebula. So now we'll just do a quick stretch, and again I use the screen transfer function. And this is a bit of a balancing act. I typically will darken the background and brighten the nebula some, and I'll try to get the background as dark as I can without it looking like I'm starting to lose some of the lighter nebula areas. And It doesn't have to be perfect because, again, we'll fine-tune that once we get to Photoshop. So now I have stretched that image. It's now non-linear, and I want to run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator. And to do that, I'm using a process container because I'm going to run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator with just standard settings. I've created a process container and then saved that over here in my process icons that runs Noise Exterminator and then immediately runs Star Exterminator right after it. So that gives me an extra 15 seconds that I can go check email or get a sip of coffee or brush my hair or do whatever I need to do to look presentable to record a tutorial on YouTube. And as soon as this is done, we'll have a nice, clean, starless image. And usually there's going to be some residue left by Star Exterminator. We can see there's some bright spots here that we'll probably want to remove. And then we've got a bright smudge here that will need cleaned up in Photoshop. But other than that, this is done and ready to be saved again. So we'll save this as a file, save as, go to the same directory, and we'll save this again as a 16-bit TIFF. So we just select 16-bit when we get to the TIFF settings. And again, because I've already done this, I'm just going to hit cancel, but normally I would hit save. And at this point, we really just do the same steps with oxygen. Let's take a quick preview. We'll run Blur Exterminator on the oxygen to tighten up the stars and sharpen the nebula. Then I'll do the stretch, noise reduction, Star Exterminator, and do the same thing with hydrogen. So I think what I'll do at this point is just pause the video until I've run the oxygen and the hydrogen, and then we'll pick it back up there. Okay, so I am back, and we now have all three of the narrowband images done. This is the sulfur, this is the oxygen, and this is hydrogen. And one of the things I usually will do just for fun at this point is do a quick SHO channel combination. So we'll grab the hydrogen here and drop it in the green, which is where it would go for an SHO image. The oxygen will go in blue, and sulfur will go in red. That gives us SHO. And we'll just see what that looks like, but it typically will come out like this, which is a very strong green cast. And if you've done any SHO processing, you know that's kind of the challenge is how do you get an SHO image but also avoid having that very strong green color cast. And the thing I do is what I call a natural SHO, where I map hydrogen to much more of an orange color rather than a green color. And I do that in Photoshop. And at this point, I would leave PixInsight and go to Photoshop. So let's do that. And I have saved all of these images. I did, by the way, also save the plain RGB image without the stars. Some nebula, even though like the Wizard is primarily thought of as a emission nebula, they sometimes have distinct reflection components that you can only pick up in the RGB data. It doesn't look like there's any here, but just in case, I've captured that as well. So I'm actually going to exit from PixInsight, and this is the image that we're hoping to get something like that. So we'll open up Photoshop, and this will just take a couple seconds to load. If you've watched any of my videos in the past, you've probably seen me do this time and again because it's pretty much the start is pretty standard. So the first thing we'll do is in Photoshop, we go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And the reason we're doing this is because we want each one of those files that we're going to work with to be presented in Photoshop as a layer rather than as a channel. We do all of our work on layers, not on channels. And we do everything in a non-destructive fashion. So here are the stars in the 3 narrowband images. And let's just go ahead and load the RGB just for the heck of it. So this will give us the RGB, stars, and then the hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. Click OK, and then click OK again. And Photoshop will go through and load these 5 files, and you'll see them pop in over here as layers. And because at least one of these layers is an RGB image, it will convert everything to RGB. If I wasn't loading an RGB component, it would load it as a grayscale image. And the first thing I would need to do is go to Image Mode and change it from grayscale to RGB color. But we already are RGB color, so we're good to go. First thing I want to do is rotate this 180 degrees. Go to Image Rotation, 180 degrees, and that gets it into the orientation I'm used to. And you can see we've got quite a bit of fluff here from bright stars that would need to be removed. Let me pull the stars up to the top of the layer stack. This is the layer stack or layers palette over here on the right. And each file is loaded as a layer, and in fact the layer name corresponds now to the file name, so makes it easy to keep things straight. Process is pretty mechanical here again. I want each one of these in their own layer group, and the shortcut to do that is Control G. So if I select the stars layer, Control G, I know I'm going to add a levels adjustment and a hue saturation adjustment, and I'm going to rename this stars. And I'm going to put this in screen blending mode. If you remember, we unscreened the stars with Star Exterminator, so we use screen blending mode to put them back in, and that's right here in the blending options. So now we're back to our RGB image, although it's a little different because the stars were processed a little bit darker. And we have control now. We can make the stars even dimmer if we want to minimize them a little bit. And we can see around some of the brighter stars we've got some haloing in the background. And generally we'll want to remove that, especially in the narrowband data. So I think the first thing I'll do is just collapse that group with the disclosure triangle here. I can turn the star layer off. And let's look at our RGB layer since we're here. I just did Control G to put it into its own group. And we want to clean up these halos. And I'm going to be fairly crude in my approach here. I'm just going to use the healing brush. It works kind of like the clone stamp, only it blends. So I'll tap J for the healing brush. And you can alternate click like you would with the clone stamp to select a source and then just paint over the area that you're wanting to heal. And you can see it does a very nice job of blending that in with whatever you have sampled from. And we've got a few places where we have fairly bright halos, and we'll just clean those up. I'm not sure if this is a halo or if this is actually some reflection nebula. Let's turn the stars back on and see. Well, that's probably some reflection nebula, so I think I'll leave that. This is obviously a reflection nebula up here, so we'll leave that. This looks like, so we'll want to clean this up a little bit. The more data you have, the fewer problems that you have to deal with. So at this point, that's probably good enough. Since we're really not planning to do much with this, I would typically throw a levels adjustment layer where we can adjust the brightness of this. And you can see to me it looks like there's a lot of noise and junk in the background that we may or may not want. I might do a color balance if I feel like I need to adjust the color balance any. Even though we color balance the stars, sometimes the nebula looks better with a little bit different color balance. The last thing I'm going to use here is a trick I use frequently to kind of neutralize the background. That most of this background appears to be mostly noise. So what I'm going to do is a couple steps. First, I'm going to just add a blank background with a solid color fill layer. And I'll choose a fairly dark color, something like 18-18-18 for the RGB components, which is a very dark gray. Then I'll put this in lighten blending mode. So what this layer is doing is anything that's darker than 18-18-18, it elevates it to that level. And if I turn this layer on and off, we can see it's really not affecting anything. But if I come back to my levels adjustment, for some reason I've got two, so let me get rid of the one we're not using. If I come back to our levels adjustment, if I darken the blacks, they will start to disappear, and instead we'll see that black background. So I try to find a balancing point that's leaving everything I want to leave. There's still some stuff that I think is just distracting noise. So I'm going to come to just below that solid color fill, and I'm going to add a blank layer, and I'm going to put it in soft light blending mode. And the reason I'm using soft light is I can paint with a black brush at relatively low opacity, and it will darken, or in photography terms, it will burn, which is burning in or darkening. If I paint with white, it will brighten. And so usually I'll just grab the brush tool, and with black and white as my foreground background colors, you can see over here on the left in the toolbar. If I tap the X key, I can quickly switch between black and white. I'm currently at 10% opacity, which you can see in the toolbar at the top. If I wanted to change that, I could, for instance, tap the 3 key and it would change to 30%. 0 would make it 100%, but we're going to work with 10%. To darken some of these areas so that they disappear, I'll just make the brush a little bigger, paint with 10% opacity, and as I go over these areas, they eventually are darkened down below my 18-18 threshold, and so that gives me just a nice, smooth, dark black background. So I'll just go around any place where I see things that I think are just noise and not real data, or if it's not enough data to actually do anything, I will just darken that down so it disappears. In the center, I may want to brighten this a little bit, so I'll switch to a white brush, and you can see if I paint over it here, I'm actually brightening that area. So for RGB data, that looks fairly decent. I might bring some of this back up a little bit. It's just a matter of working to taste. Yeah, I can turn the stars on and off to see what it looks like with stars. And you'll see me zooming in and out. Sometimes it helps to work large, sometimes I work smaller. We may want to add some saturation to this. So I'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer, add a little saturation to the RGB. And that's probably not a bad place to leave the RGB, which we didn't even set out to do an RGB image, but we got one just as a bonus. So at this point, I'll close the RGB. I will double click to label a group, and I'm just going to move it down to the bottom out of the way. Now let's deal with the narrowband. We've got hydrogen at the top, and then oxygen, and then sulfur on the bottom. And we'll start with sulfur. Most of this looks pretty clean until you zoom in, and then you can start to see there's some dots left in here from star removal, some smudges. We've got a smudge here that was left. We've got some smudges here. So let's get rid of the smudges first, and I'm going to do those the same way I did the RGB. I'll start by dropping this into a group. change the group name to sulfur. Click on the layer itself. Grab my spot healing brush by tapping the J key, and that will bring up the spot healing brush. Do a quick alternate click, and we'll get rid of this big smudge from the star removal by just painting in some background. Some of these just look like star residual, but we can just very quickly use the spot healing brush to clean those up. Here we've got a smudge, so I will sample from someplace that looks like what this probably looks like and heal that. And most of this is going to be pretty well hidden when we get done anyway, so what we heal with isn't nearly as important as making it somewhat uniform. So at this point, I'll say that layer looks pretty good. We've got some vignetting, bright vignetting in the corners. Again, I'll just use the healing brush and paint into the corner to even those tones up a little bit. That will probably be cropped out, but just in case. So now I want to do a couple things. I want to sharpen this, and then we're going to have to deal with some of this residual star noise. First thing I want to do is sharpen it. And if you remember, I said I try to do everything non-destructively. So in order to sharpen and remove noise and do things non-destructively, I'm going to convert this layer into a smart object. And what that lets me do is apply filters non-destructively. So I'll right-click to the right of the file name and choose Convert to Smart Object. And you'll see a little thumb icon that appears on the layer thumbnail. That tells me that this is a smart object. And the nice thing about a smart object is it preserves it just as it was when I converted it to a smart object. And I can go back and re-edit that without affecting anything else. I can also apply filters non-destructively. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply a sharpen filter, and I generally use Smart Sharpen for this. And I find generally this data needs a fair amount of sharpening. So it's a fairly large radius and a fairly high amount. And I'll just click OK, and that will apply sharpening, and that really crisps up this nebula detail, but it will also crisp up some of the artifacts that we had from star removal. And that's the next thing we want to deal with. But we want to deal with that selectively. And notice the two things here. Notice that the Smart Sharpen showed up kind of separate from the layer. And in fact, I can double click on the filter and reopen it, change the settings if I want to make it more or less aggressive. Click OK, and it will reapply that filter to the base layer that's never been changed. So I can iteratively try different sharpening settings, plus or minus. I want to use some noise reduction to clean up some of the star problems, but I don't want to apply it directly to this smart object because I've got this nicely sharpened. So what I'm going to do is convert this to a smart object again. So this is kind of, if you want to think of layers of smart object, this was a layer converted to a smart object and then converted to a second smart object. The sharpen filter is now kind of intrinsic within this smart object, and now I can apply another filter. So I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches, and usually somewhere in the 8 to 15 to 20 range, depending on how noisy the image is. We'll do a good job of getting rid of any of those artifacts from star removal. The problem is, as you can see, it also really softened the nebula. The good thing is this came with a mask. This white box is the mask for the filter, and that's the reason I converted this to a second smart object. is I can now work on this mask painting with either black or white. Black will hide the effect of the sharpening, or the blurring in this case. White will reveal it. So any case I paint with black on this mask will hide that. So I'm going to grab the brush tool. I'm going to make black my foreground color. I'm going to tap 0 to go to 100% opacity. And I'm just going to paint with black here where I have a lot of detail and restore that sharpened detail. And you can see there's a couple places where when I do that, there's, right here, there's some stars that some of those artifacts are showing through, and I want to hide that. So now I'll just switch to white, and I'm going to make the brush quite a bit smaller with the left bracket key. And I'll paint with white to restore the dust and scratches filter very selectively in these areas where we have a lot of detail and we don't want to smudge the detail. So I'm really just painting that spot removal very selectively and carefully in areas with high detail. So that we really get the best of both worlds. We're getting the sharpening and all of the detail from the layer originally, but then I'm using the noise reduction tool of dust and scratches to remove those star artifacts. So that gives us a pretty clean, smooth layer. The last thing I would do is just pop a levels adjustment, and typically I'll darken the background to something fairly dark. I may brighten the whites a little bit, and that's probably pretty close to where we're going to end up with the sulfur layer. So now we just need to do the same thing to the hydrogen and oxygen. So I'll collapse this. Let's turn on the next layer. This is oxygen, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly now that you know the steps. Control G to drop it into a group. Grab the spot healing brush with the, I can use the tool shortcut J, the keyboard shortcut. Get rid of some of these big blotches. Be on the lookout. Here you can even see a little bit of the diffraction spikes. Generally we want to take those out with the spot healing brush. Pay special attention to the corners. If we have bright or dark corners, we'll just make those a little bit more uniform. This is probably pretty good at this point. So now we want to, sometimes it's worthwhile if you have large artifacts to take them out with the healing brush or the spot healing brush before you do the noise reduction. So convert to a smart object, and first we want to sharpen. So filter, sharpen, smart sharpen, and I'll just use the same. I may even go a little bit stronger on this one. It was not quite as crisp, so we'll sharpen it a little bit more. And again, we can always come back and change this if we decide it's too aggressive. So this will sharpen the oxygen details. And as soon as this finishes, now we'll convert it to a smart object again. Convert to smart object and filter dust and scratches. And again, we'll apply a fairly large dust and scratches radius to remove any of the remaining artifacts that are out here in the background area. And then with the brush tool, we'll paint with black to bring back the detail where we want it. You can see on the mask, on the little thumbnail, you can see where we're painting. And again, this is all non-destructive. Zoom in and see if, again, we have some that we need to clean up. So we'll switch to white, go to a much smaller brush, and clean up some of these artifacts that are in areas where there is detail that we don't want to blur. So it's really just kind of a process of sharpening, blurring, and then finding the right balance. And we can always paint that dust and scratches, noise reduction into any area, large or small. So it's applied very broadly around the outside where there's not much detail, and it's masked so that we're seeing the sharp detail here in the center. And then again, we'll quickly add a levels adjustment and roughly adjust this to about where we think we want to end up. And this will also be fine-tuned as we get further into the editing process. So the last one is the hydrogen. Again, we'll go through this very quickly. Label this. And I guess I neglected to label the oxygen. So this one, the hydrogen usually comes out much cleaner. You see there's really not much in the way of artifacts from the star removal. So I'll just quickly convert this to a smart object. If we do find something, we can always go back. Smart sharpen. And this may take less sharpening because it has more detail. So I'll turn down the sharpening a little bit. And one of the nice things about this is you can really fine-tune the sharpening for each layer. It gives you a very easy visual way of working. So now we've sharpened it, and we do have some artifacts here in the background, so I'm going to go ahead and do the same technique of converting to a smart object a second time in order to add the dust and scratches filter. So that's noise, dust and scratches. Click OK. And this time I'm just going to click on the mask, and you can see the little double outline showed up around the mask icon. I can just invert this whole mask with Control-I. So now the whole mask is filled with black, which hides this dust and scratches effect. Now with the brush tool, I can zoom in and really work just on areas where we have artifacts that show up without broadly blurring any of these areas. And again, as we get further in our workflow, if we find that we have problems somewhere, we can revisit any step along the way because this is all non-destructive. Quick levels adjustment to get us roughly to the using the full range of black and white. And I think I'll leave it about right there. So now we get to decide this. Now we're to the fun part. Now we can decide about color mapping and how do we want to present this. And I'm going to start with what I call natural SHO. And I call it that because you don't have to fight the green. You can use green as much or as little as you want to bring out detail. And so I'm going to start with the sulfur image. And I've got the sulfur image on the bottom. I can see there's a little bit of there are some artifacts still remaining. I think I'll ignore them for now. So we can just leave the sulfur layer as it is. We're only going to use red from the sulfur. So if we want, we can turn on just the red, or we can leave it the way it is. But if we leave it the way it is now contributing red, green, and blue, all three channels, and that's why it shows up as a grayscale image. If we go to our oxygen group, we'll turn it on. We just want green and blue from the oxygen. We're going to start by creating an SOO image. So to do that, I'm just going to double click here on the group level to the right of the layer name, and it opens this layer style blending options dialog. And you can see here in the center, since it's an RGB image, we have checkboxes for red, green, and blue. and we only want green and blue because we're going to take red from the layer below it. So if I just turn off red, watch what happens. Like that, we have an SOO image because we're getting green and blue from this layer, and the only thing left is red, and that's coming from the sulfur layer below. So just like that, we created an SOO image. If this had been the oxygen layer at the bottom, it would be an HOO image. And of course, we can turn stars on and off to see what it would look like with stars. So we're well on our way. Now we want to add the hydrogen, and we're going to add the hydrogen in a way that lets us really use it as the color balance tool. So I'm going to turn the hydrogen layer on, and I'm going to change it from pass-through blending mode to a very powerful one called screen. And what screen does is it uses all of the data on hydrogen to add to what's below. And that's why it became very bright and blown out and over the top. But we're going to do a couple things to rein this in. Remember, we've got within the hydrogen group, we've got this levels adjustment layer. I can use it to brighten or darken the hydrogen layer by itself so that it contributes more or less. But the more powerful thing we can do is change the color. And to change the color, I'm going to add, again, this is within the hydrogen group, I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. And since this is an RGB image, you'll notice in the curves adjustment layer dialog in the properties panel, it says RGB here. If I click on this, I can individually target red, green, or blue. So let's go to blue first, because we really don't want a lot of blue from our hydrogen, but we may want some. So I'm just going to grab the highlight side of the curve and pull it down, and you'll see the colors start to become more yellow or less yellow, just depending on where I put this blue slider. So I'll just pick a spot somewhere near the bottom, but we're still getting some blue effect from the hydrogen. Now let's go to the green, and we can do the same thing. We can get less green or more green, and how I adjust this up or down affects the color balance. Do we want less green, which would be, the less green we have in here, the more true to life it is. The more green we allow in, the more it becomes kind of a yellow-orange, and the more separation we'll see between the hydrogen and the sulfur. In real life, they're both red. By adjusting the green component here, we can get either more separation or more close to true color. And usually I'll put a fair amount of green in so that we get a good color range and a good color contrast between hydrogen and sulfur. So that's fairly close to a finished image in terms of our SHO, and we're not doing anything with RGB. It's completely blocked down here. You see I can turn it on and off. It's not contributing anything. So the last thing I might do is my overall adjustments, and so I will add, and these are layers, adjustment layers I know I typically use. I'll add a levels adjustment, a color balance, a hue saturation, and those are the three that I will typically use to fine-tune the image at this level. And I'll start with levels and adjust the overall brightness and contrast. Maybe something like that. I'll go to the color, and we can play with color balance to further fine-tune if we want to adjust the color some. You can adjust color balance here, or if I go back, for instance, to the oxygen, which is blue-green, I can adjust by adjusting the amount of cyan in the oxygen contribution, I can change its contribution and hence the color balance. A very powerful way to adjust it is with hue saturation. I can certainly turn up the saturation. I can also adjust the color balance here globally. I can also target an individual color. For instance, if I target just the yellows, we can make the yellows more green or more red. And that's just a matter of adjusting to taste. I might target the reds and bring up the saturation of the reds and maybe make them a little bit more red by sliding the hue slider a little bit to the left. Basically whatever you want to adjust. This is where you adjust visually and to taste. And here we can start to see, because this is cyan, we can see, oh, here's some residual that's showing up from the oxygen layer. So there's some diffraction spikes that I didn't remove in the very beginning. And we're also seeing some noise. So the noise I can clean up just by going back to this mask on the oxygen layer, grab the brush tool, and I want to paint with white, and I want to paint with a pretty small brush, but you'll see any place I paint with white, and I know this is on the oxygen layer because the spots that are showing up are cyan. So I can clean up those areas that didn't really appear to cause a problem until after we had colorized and started putting things together. Since it's cyan, I know it's on the oxygen layer. If it were red, then it would be probably on either the sulfur or the hydrogen layer. And since I'm painting with a broad brush, I'm only affecting the details where it matters. But I do need to come back to this spot right here and clean that up. And I need to clean that up kind of way back on the original oxygen layer. So the way I get to that, remember these are all smart objects. If I double click on the layer thumbnail of a smart object, it will open that object. So remember the step before that was that we made this a smart object and applied the sharpen filter before we did the noise. If I double click on this again, this will go back one more step, and you can see on the tabs at the top that it's actually opened this as a separate document. There's the area that we need to clean up. So I'll just grab the spot healing brush, find an area that looks appropriate, and we'll clean that up. So those diffraction spikes are gone. So now when I close this tab, if I just click on the X, it will ask me, do I want to save the changes? I do, so I'll say yes. It will update the smart object for sharpening. That's what it's doing now in the background. So there's our next smart object. We don't need to change anything here, so I'll just close this and again say yes, because even though we didn't change this smart object, we changed the smart object that is contained within it. Because remember, this is a nested smart object. And now when this updates, that area of diffraction spikes is gone. So we might come back and fine-tune our hue, saturation, and color balance. I might use that same trick of just driving some of the background to black. So again, I'll add a solid color background layer and put it around, I find around 18 works pretty well. Again, put it in light and blending mode. At this point, everything is brighter than, or almost everything is brighter than that. You see it's got a little bit of an effect here, but I think I'm going to darken some of this other area, so I'll go just below it. Add a blank layer in soft light blending mode. Grab my brush tool, X for black is my foreground. I'll go to 10% opacity, make the brush bigger, and we'll just darken some of this area that doesn't have much interesting information in it. If we want to brighten any areas, we can paint with white. to brighten. If we want to selectively darken, just paint with black. And if we want to intensify color, we can even paint with color on a soft light layer. So for instance, if I want to intensify this teal, I can sample that color. And when I paint with that, it will intensify the color. I can do the same thing with red, or even with the orange. So it just kind of selectively intensifies some of the color. Come back to black here in the corner. And again, most of this is probably going to be cropped out. And let's turn the stars on and see what we've got. Not too bad. The last thing I might do is go to the stars layer and sharpen the stars a little bit. So I will convert that to a smart object. Filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. Generally, I find stars don't need as much sharpening, so I'll usually turn down both the radius and the amount. And frequently, I find small stars can get too noisy looking when you sharpen them. They become too crisp and too dominant. So we may want to use a mask to constrain our sharpening just to the larger, more prominent stars. So we can control I on the mask that hides that sharpening, and then painting on the mask with the brush tool at 100% opacity will just bring back the sharpening on some of these larger, more dominant stars. Something like that. I want to come back to our hue saturation. Maybe play with some of the colors by selectively targeting some of the individual colors and decide, do we want our yellow to get a little bit more prominent? Something like that. Do we want our cyan to be a little bit more on the blue side? We can make a lot of adjustments just with hue saturation. But at this point, I'm going to say that's probably pretty good. So I would save this now as go to File, Save As, and I want to save this, and I'm going to actually save it, or I want to keep it, and I'm going to save it as a large document format, and we'll call this Wizard Natural SHO for video, and click Save. And this is saving everything with all the layers intact. I can come back later today, tomorrow, next month, next year, reopen this, and it will have all the layers intact, and I can even reopen these smart objects and go back to make those individual adjustments if I need to. So at this point, that is done. I would typically then open this in Lightroom for cropping and whatever final adjustments I want to make. So that is the natural SHO workflow and how you get to this point. And of course, the colors are just a matter of taste and what your vision is for the individual image. You can make it whatever color you want. We could convert this to a more standard SHO. You could make an HOO image, an SOO, OHS, pretty much whatever you want, just by adjusting the colors in these three layer groups right here. Just to show you how quick and easy that is, let's say I wanted to turn this into an OHS. Sulfur is still going to be the same. It's contributing all three. We would just go to oxygen, double click, and we'll make it just red. And then we'll go to hydrogen, and we'll make it just green, and through blending mode. And then the last thing we would have to do with the hydrogen, because we had it adjusted for screen blending mode is turn off our curves layer and then reset the levels adjustment. So got green for hydrogen. I'm double checking here because it doesn't look quite right. Oxygen should be just blue, or I'm sorry, just red. And that's leaving sulfur is just blue. And let's turn off. So there's kind of the an OHS color palette that then you could work on that and convert it into something different. So that's the process. I apologize for this being such a long video, but I wanted to really go through all the different steps that I use so you can see all the details of how I process a natural SHO color palette image. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. If you like this video and found it useful, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. That always helps and lets me know what kind of content you enjoy. So with that, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.